For value-based interpretive planning to work, it must employ a planning approach that actually leads to plan implementation. The interpretive field often holds up the interpretive plan as an important tool for interpretation, for heritage site management. But is it really? And the answer to that question is, it depends. But to understand interpretive planning, first we have to understand about planning and planning implementation in general. And to start that story, I'm going to begin in 1990 when I worked with a nonprofit conservation organization called Rare Center for Tropical Conservation. I was based in Honduras. We did an informal study at the time of heritage plans in Latin America. And what we found is that of the many different kinds of protected area and heritage plans that were out there, most were partially and totally unimplemented. And this was happening all across the Latin American landscape. It was literally an epidemic of non-implementation. But we wondered, what were the true barriers to this non-implementation? Because even back then, we had this notion that it wasn't simply a lack of resources, which everyone then and now still blames when their plans don't get implemented. We knew that it had something to do with power. Something had to change. So when I was at Rare, we began a project with UNESCO World Heritage Center about biodiversity conservation and sustainable tourism. And we worked with 6 World Heritage sites in Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and Indonesia. And our investigation of non-implementation continued through those experiences. And we discovered that all of these plans, the ones that we worked on and others worked on, they were done from a modernist perspective. That is, this modernist perspective highly valued a technical, methodical, empirical, rational planning process. It was top-down, scientific, and highly apolitical. Plans were modeled after scientific studies. And if one doesn't have the technical knowledge, then they're not qualified to participate in the decision-making. This meant that most stakeholders were relegated to low levels of participation. And they could offer opinions and share their needs that the technical planning consultants could then take into consideration in the plan or just simply ignore. Because plans are published like scientific papers, they're inscribed in stone, very difficult to update. Because they are technical and they exclude power sharing of most of the stakeholders, then those stakeholders feel no ownership for the plan. They didn't contribute much to it, and they certainly don't feel a commitment to implement it. And because to create a technical plan, planners must also assume that the world is simple and changes very slowly. Otherwise, their plans, written in stone, would become outdated very quickly, which they are anyway. Now, after my time with Rare, I took this methodology, this public use planning, holistic planning methodology, to UNESCO itself at the World Heritage Center. And with their support, we traveled around the world and applied the methodology in Vietnam, Kenya, Portugal, Belize, Montenegro, Macedonia, quite a variety of cultures, languages, and geographies. And based on all of this experience, we came up with a thesis. And the thesis was this: the social process for planning is more important than the document itself. It is the social process that empowers the community, builds its capacities, social cohesion, and the trust needed to facilitate its own planning and then implement it, eventually without any outside assistance. So that's the idea. And this experience and that thesis eventually led to a book that I co-wrote with Dr. Stephen McCool, who's a world-renowned specialist in wildlands planning and management from the University of Montana. Our book is called The Future Has Other Plans, Planning Holistically to Conserve Natural and Cultural Heritage. The book documents all the flaws of rational, technical, modernist planning that we saw all across the world. Indeed, this wasn't an epidemic in Latin America. This was a global pandemic. We also saw that many fields and disciplines were actually innovating new ways to get around, to transcend this modernist thinking. to overcome its weaknesses. And we wanted to know how we could weave these together into a new holistic planning paradigm. We came to realize that this paradigm to avoid barriers was actually approached similar to what today we call the values-based heritage interpretation or interpretive planning, but at a community development level. To empower communities both to plan and implement their plans, outsiders had to let go of what philosophers call technical rationality and move to adaptive management, where plans are constantly being updated, just like software, like Microsoft Word version 1, version 2, version 3, every year, forever. And the planning process itself, if highly participatory, convenes the exact group of stakeholders who need to develop collective capacities like conflict management and common collective visioning, planning and facilitation skills. Now, if you take this holistic planning approach, then you quickly come to realize that the plan itself is nothing more than a mere vessel to document community agreements. It's not a prize, and it's certainly not the end game. So I'm going to give you an example from Europe of where we tried to do this, and from Evora, a World Heritage City in Portugal. A city back in the 2003 or so, wanted to develop, no, it's later than 2011, wanted to develop an interpretive strategy from a holistic perspective. Our nonprofit, the PUP Global Heritage Consortium, yeah, here's the logo right here, was participating in a UNESCO program called the Program of World Heritage Sites of Portuguese Origin. So we got to work with Evora, and the conditions were nearly ideal to do this. The head of the historic center was a participant in this project I mentioned, and he really liked the idea of this participatory public use planning, visitor use planning. That's the PUP in our name. And they had a real need for a strong interpretive strategy. The whole team embraced it, and effectively the city had too much congestion at just a few attractions, and they wanted to help disperse people or show them other parts of the city so they wouldn't all congregate in one place. That was what the problem they wanted to solve. And the planning team involved people from all across the municipality and also the community. A great team with highly participatory aspirations. They were gung-ho and excited. And together we began this process, which I will now briefly show you in some slides. I will say the team was doing a great job. They were doing their own planning and facilitating. And I, as the consultant, all I did was provide the methodology and guidance. It was their process, and they could have produced a great example in Europe. But then came municipal elections. The Communist Party won, kicked out the mayor, all of the staff, and our project was over. So let me show you some of those pictures from Evora. You can see the city has all kinds of architecture from different ages. This was the methodology, and they decided to make their own posters so they could share it with the community, the different steps in the standard public use planning, holistic planning methodology, the different modules. And they wanted to have a big community event where they not only present the methodology, but community members sign the terms of reference. It wasn't just the municipality, it was the community that agreed to these terms of reference in this sort of fancy event here. There's the gung-ho, excited team took the lead, doing different kinds of workshops here. For example, producing the interpretive framework, which is a community-based tool for producing hierarchical themes that they would be using for interpretation. Obviously, we won't go through them, but you can see the hierarchy in the example that they produced here in Portuguese. They analyzed their different attractions and their stories as the raw material for the interpretation. They created zoning system based on public use, right? Where the different zones indicate, I think in this case, there's like different densities. And here you can see they had the historic center, the extramural or urban area, and the rural area around the city. So they had 3 zones, and they divide up into 13 sectors, where a sector is defined by a public use function. So each of these different sectors had a different public use function. And they mapped all the access routes and the stations and the parking that go into the city. This is just one of the sectors. and the different section that they propose, and the parking and the route and the interpretation associated with it. Here are some of the attractions. And they were planning on interpretive signs that would lead people from outside the city into the city along a series of different routes. As you can see, they're color-coded routes. Another example of what would have been an interpretive sign had they not lost the election. And so on and so forth. So in conclusion, some argue that the Sustainable Development Goals from UNESCO are generally failing because they're only outer goals. They largely ignore the inner development goals that must accompany the outer development goals to effect real change. This is why the organization Inner Development Goals was started, to propose what those inner development goals are that need to complement the outer development to get a holistic development. Yet holistic planning has always been working on inner development of individuals and collectives. It's always focused on assisting the entire community of interests. Consultants in this context, like interpreters, they're no longer experts that do the planning, that do the interpretation for the community. Rather, they are the facilitators so that the heritage owners can plan and interpret their own heritage and their own future, and eventually without consultants. Otherwise, natural and cultural heritage plans will always continue to end up on the shelves. Muito obrigado. And here's a couple of resources that might be useful. The book itself can be found on Amazon. And if you don't want to read the book, there's a good summary article which actually uses interpretive planning as its example in Planning Magazine, the magazine of the American Planning Association, which you can find at my ResearchGate profile. Well, thank you very much.